The snow had been falling for 31 hours without pause when Edith Calloway made the decision that would define the rest of her winter. It was the 3rd of February, 1891, and the storm that had rolled down from the Canadian plains had settled over the hill country of northern Minnesota with the kind of patient, total commitment that old-timers recognized not as weather, but as intent. The barometer on the kitchen wall had not moved in 2 days. The wind had packed the snow against the north and east walls of her cabin to a depth that covered the lower sill of the only window on that side, and the drifts in the yard had erased the distinction between ground and sky in a way that made the world outside look less like a landscape and more like a wall. Edith stood at her kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface and looked at the numbers she had written on a piece of brown paper bag. 14 pounds of cornmeal, 6 pounds of salt pork, a half tin of coffee, 2 jars of preserved green beans put up in September, 1 small wheel of hard cheese. She had done the arithmetic 3 times and arrived at the same answer each time. If the storm held another 2 days, which the sky suggested it would, and if the temperature stayed where it was, which was 19 below zero, and dropping toward what felt like further, she had perhaps 24 hours of adequate fuel remaining for the fireplace. After that she had the furniture, and after that she had the walls, and after that she had nothing at all. She was 36 years old, a widow of 14 months, and she had survived her first winter alone on this claim through a combination of preparation, stubbornness, and luck. She was not prepared to rely on again. She had 80 acres of hill country land in Kittson County, a small cabin her husband George had built in the summer of 1887, a barn with 2 horses and a milk cow, and a spring house 22 feet from her back door that she had not been able to reach in 3 days. That spring house was the problem, and it was also, she had just decided, the solution. George Calloway had been a practical and methodical man, which was one of the things Edith had loved about him, and one of the things that had made his death from a logging accident in December of 1889 feel not just like grief, but like a kind of structural failure, as if the load-bearing wall of a house had simply been removed without warning. He had built the Springhouse in the autumn of 1888, the second year on the claim, positioning it over the natural cold spring that surfaced at the base of the hill behind the cabin. The spring ran at a constant temperature of 51 degrees year-round, cold enough in summer to keep butter firm and milk fresh for days, warm enough in winter to prevent freezing even when the air above it dropped to 40 below. George had built the Springhouse from fieldstone mortared with clay and lime, with a cedar shake roof and a heavy timber door that faced south to catch what winter sun there was. Inside, shelved along the stone walls, were the provisions that Edith had put up through the summer and autumn of 1890, the first full season she had managed entirely alone, and 47-quart jars of preserved vegetables and fruit, 12 pounds of dried venison, a crock of lard, 2 pounds of dried beans, a full side of salt pork hung from the ceiling beam, enough food to see her through to April with careful management. None of it was accessible. The drift between the cabin back door and the Springhouse door was 6 feet deep and still building, and she had tried twice in the past 2 days to reach it, on turning back both times when the wind made it impossible to see her own hands in front of her face. The distance was 22 feet. It might as well have been 22 miles. The fuel situation was the thing that had finally forced the calculation. She had known about the food in the Springhouse. She had been hoping the storm would break, and she could simply walk across the yard and retrieve what she needed. But the barometer had not moved, and the sky had not changed, and the fuel was running out, and hoping was no longer a strategy she could afford. She needed the Springhouse, not just for its food, but for what the spring itself represented. A constant temperature of 51 degrees, earth-sheltered stone walls 2 feet thick, a space that would never freeze, regardless of what the air above it did. If she could get to it, she could survive inside it indefinitely. The question was how to get there without dying in the attempt. The idea of the tunnel came to her the way good ideas often come, not as a sudden inspiration, but as the logical conclusion of a series of smaller observations she had been making for days without fully recognizing their significance. She had noticed that the snow directly against the cabin's back wall was different from the snow in the open yard. It was compacted, dense, wind-packed into something closer to ice than powder, which meant it would hold a shape if she cut into it. She had noticed that the drift between the cabin and the Springhouse followed the line of the old kitchen garden fence, which ran in a nearly straight path from one structure to the other. She had noticed that the bottom of the drift, where it met the frozen ground, was less densely packed than the upper layers because the wind had deposited rather than compressed it there. She had noticed all of these things separately over 3 days of watching through the window, and now, standing at the kitchen table with the brown paper calculations in front of her, she put them together into a single coherent plan. She would not go over the drift. She would go through it. She would cut a tunnel from the cabin's back door to the Springhouse door, shoring it as she went with the cedar planks she had stacked against the inside of the barn wall since October, hauling them inside yesterday before the storm made the barn unreachable. She estimated the tunnel would need to be roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet high, which meant she could work on her hands and knees or in a low crouch. She estimated the excavation, if the snow held the consistency she believed it would, would take her between 8 and 12 hours of sustained work. She had a coal shovel, a garden spade, and a hand saw for cutting blocks. She had the cedar planks for shoring. She had perhaps 24 hours of fuel remaining, which meant she needed to begin immediately and work without stopping for anything that was not absolutely necessary. She pulled on her heaviest wool coat, tied her scarf across her face below her eyes, and opened the back door. The first 2 feet were the hardest. The snow at the door threshold had been compressed by 3 days of wind pressure into something that resisted the shovel with a firmness she had not anticipated, and she had to use the garden spade as a chisel, driving it in with the heel of her boot and levering blocks free rather than scooping. The blocks she stacked to the sides of the entry, building low walls that would help hold the tunnel shape. Her breath fogged heavily in the cold air, and she could feel the temperature difference immediately between the relative shelter of the tunnel entrance and the open air above, a difference of perhaps 8 degrees in her estimation, which was not much but was something. By the time she had penetrated 4 feet into the drift, she had broken enough of a sweat under her coat that she had to stop and unbutton the top 2 buttons despite the cold, because overheating was as dangerous as freezing if she soaked her underlayers and then stopped moving. She had learned that from George, who had learned it from his father, who had homesteaded in Wisconsin, in conditions not much different from these. Wet wool still insulates, he had told her once. Wet cotton kills. She was wearing wool throughout, and she was careful about it. By the end of the second hour, she had penetrated 9 feet into the drift and had established a working rhythm, cutting blocks with the spade, passing them back through the tunnel to stack at the entry, moving forward 6 inches at a time, with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that speed was the enemy of sustainable work, and that sustainable work was the only kind that mattered today. The snow was holding its shape better than she had hoped. The compression that had made the first 2 feet so difficult was deeper into the drift, actually working in her favor. The walls of the tunnel standing firm, without any shoring at all through the first 10 feet. She placed the first cedar plank at the 11-foot mark, where the snow above her shifted slightly when she moved and sent a fine powder trickling down onto the back of her neck. She cut the plank to length with the hand saw and wedged it horizontally across the tunnel ceiling, notching the ends into the snow walls with her spade so it sat without support. The resistance it provided was minimal in a structural sense, but the psychological effect of having a solid timber above her head was immediate and significant. She placed a second plank 2 feet further along and a third 2 feet beyond that, and by the time she had done this, the tunnel had a character that felt less like a hole in a snowdrift and more like a constructed space, which was what she needed it to be. She was at the 15-foot mark by what she estimated was early afternoon, though the light filtering through the snow above her gave no reliable indication of time, only a faint blue-white glow that was the same whether it was noon or 3 o'clock. Her hands had gone through 3 cycles of cold and warm and cold again, and she had stopped twice to go back inside and stand by the fire for 10 minutes, not out of weakness, but out of the understanding that a person whose hands have lost their dexterity makes mistakes that a person with functional hands does not, and a mistake inside a snow tunnel at 19 below zero was not a recoverable situation. On her second return to the cabin, she added the last substantial log to the fireplace and noted that what remained in the woodpile beside the hearth would last perhaps 6 more hours at the rate she was burning. She went back into the tunnel. If these stories of frontier ingenuity and hard-won survival speak to you, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Every week, we document the forgotten wisdom of the men and women who faced conditions that would defeat most modern people, and found solutions not through technology or luck, but through careful observation, physical courage, and the willingness to work when working was the only option left. Your subscription helps keep these accounts alive and ensures the lessons they contain are not lost. The stories are worth preserving. Subscribe and be part of that effort. At the 18-foot mark, she encountered something she had not anticipated: the garden fence. She had known intellectually that the fence ran between the cabin and the Springhouse, had in fact used it as a navigational reference when planning the tunnel's direction, but she had not thought carefully enough about what it would mean to encounter it underground. The fence was a simple post and rail construction, cedar posts set 2 feet deep, with 2 horizontal rails between them, and the bottom rail sat at approximately the height of her tunnel ceiling, which meant that in order to continue, she needed to either go over it, which would require raising the tunnel height and risking collapse, or go under it, which would require dropping the tunnel floor by 8 inches and then raising it again on the other side, or go through it, which meant cutting the rail. She chose to cut the rail. It took her 11 minutes with the handsaw, working in a space too narrow to get a full stroke. Wherein the sawdust fell into her hair and down the back of her neck and mixed with the snow powder that had been accumulating there since the first plank went in. She pulled the cut section free and pushed it back behind her and continued forward. 4 feet left by her estimation, 3 feet. The cold in the tunnel had stabilized at what felt like 10 or 12 below zero, significantly warmer than the open air above, but cold enough that she could feel it working at the exposed skin around her eyes, the only part of her face not covered by the scarf. She pulled her hat lower and kept moving. The shovel broke through into the Springhouse at the 2-foot mark from what she had estimated would be the door, which was close enough that she allowed herself a single moment of satisfaction before she began enlarging the opening. The air that came through the hole was different in a way that was immediately physically apparent. It was not warm in any conventional sense, but it was not the aggressive, stripping cold of the tunnel either. It was still. It carried the faint mineral smell of the spring, and the dry wooden smell of the cedar shelving, and the deeper smell of preserved food, brine and vinegar, and the particular sweetness of dried fruit. She widened the opening with the spade until it matched the tunnel diameter, and then pushed through into the Springhouse and stood up for the first time in what felt like hours, her back straightening with a series of small protests she ignored. The temperature inside was 49 degrees. By the small thermometer George had nailed to the wall beside the door when he built the place, or 2 degrees below the spring's natural output, which meant the stone walls were doing exactly what 2-foot fieldstone walls mortared with clay and lime are designed to do in a Minnesota winter. The spring itself ran in a narrow channel cut into the stone floor, entering from a gap in the north wall and exiting through a corresponding gap in the south wall, its surface moving with the quiet, indifferent constancy of water that has been flowing through that hillside since before anyone alive could remember. Edith stood in the Springhouse and breathed the still air and felt the specific quality of relief that belongs only to people who have done a hard and necessary thing and arrived at the other side of it. She allowed herself 30 seconds of this and then began to assess what she had. So the shelves were exactly as she had left them in November, the last time she had been able to get to the Springhouse before the first serious freeze. 43 quart jars, she counted, 4 having been used in early December, before the cold made regular access impractical. The dried venison, the lard, the beans, the salt pork hanging from the beam, still firm and well preserved in the cold. She took 4 jars of preserved tomatoes, the lard crock, and 2 pounds of the dried venison, loading them into the canvas bag she had brought through the tunnel for exactly this purpose. And then she stood for a moment and looked at the space itself with the particular attention of a woman who has just solved one problem and is already thinking about the next one. The Springhouse was 8 feet by 10 feet, stone floor, stone walls, cedar roof. The spring maintained a temperature that would prevent freezing indefinitely. The food stores were sufficient for months. The tunnel she had just built connected it directly to her cabin. She began to understand that she had not simply solved the immediate crisis of the food supply. She had, without fully intending to, created something considerably more significant than that. She had created a second survival space, one that was effectively immune to the cold, connected to a reliable water source, and stocked with sufficient provisions to last well into spring. If the cabin became more uninhabitable, if the fuel ran out entirely and the fireplace went cold, the Springhouse was survivable. Not comfortable, not warm in any conventional sense, but survivable. At 49 degrees, with adequate food and water, and the insulation of 2 feet of stone and the earth of the hillside above, a person could endure indefinitely. The tunnel changed everything about her situation. It transformed the Springhouse from an inaccessible asset into a functioning part of her survival system, connected and reachable regardless of what the weather above ground was doing. She picked up her canvas bag and went back through the tunnel to the cabin. The storm broke on the morning of the 5th of February, 37 hours after Edith had begun digging. She knew it had broken before she looked outside, because the quality of the silence changed. The constant background pressure of the wind against the walls, simply stopping between one moment and the next, leaving a stillness so complete she could hear the fire settling in the grate. She looked out the front window, at a landscape so white and still it looked painted, the drifts sculpted by the departed wind into formations that bore no resemblance to the yard she had known before the storm, and she felt the particular exhausted relief of a person who has come through something and is not yet sure of the full extent of what it cost. The thermometer outside read 23 below, but the sky was clear and pale blue, and the sun was on the snow, and the barometer had begun, for the first time in 5 days, to move. She had fuel for perhaps 2 more hours. She had food for weeks. She had a tunnel in her backyard that connected her cabin to a stone shelter with a spring-fed constant temperature and 43 jars of preserved food on the shelves. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and drank it slowly, which was something she hadn't done in 5 days, and looked at the brown paper calculations she had made at the beginning of all of this, the numbers that had started everything, and thought about what the tunnel had actually changed. It had changed the arithmetic. It had converted a closed system, a cabin with finite resources and no resupply possible, into an open one, connected to something that the cold could not reach and the storm could not bury. That was what George would have called solving the right problem. Not how to endure the cold better, but how to connect to something the cold could not touch. The neighbors came in the days after the storm broke, as neighbors do after hard weather, to check on the single woman on the hill claim and to offer help they assumed would be needed. Margaret Solberg came first, driving her husband's sleigh from the farm a mile and a half east, arriving with a covered pot of soup and the careful expression of a woman prepared to find things worse than she hoped. She found Edith at the back of the property, widening the tunnel entrance with the coal shovel, her coat open despite the cold, working with the easy rhythm of a person doing a familiar task. Margaret stood in the yard and looked at the low, dark opening in the drift, and then at Edith, and then back at the opening. "What is that?" she asked. Edith told her. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, looking at the tunnel entrance, and then she said, in the flat, practical tone of a Minnesota farm wife who has seen a great deal and is not easily impressed but recognizes competence when it is in front of her, that she would like to see the other end. Edith took her through. Margaret stood in the Springhouse with her soup pot still in her hands and looked at the spring and the shelves and the thermometer on the wall and did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said that her own Springhouse was 40 feet from her back door, and that last February her husband Eric had lost 2 toes to frostbite, making that crossing in a storm not much different from the one they had just come through. She said this in the same flat tone, looking at the thermometer. Edith did not say anything. She understood that Margaret was not making conversation. She was making a calculation. By the following autumn, 3 families in the surrounding area had dug connecting passages between their cabins and their outbuildings, each one adapted to their own property's particular geography. None of them were identical to Edith's tunnel. Eric Solberg built his wider and taller, tall enough to walk upright, shoring it with milled lumber rather than cedar planks. The Hendersons to the north built theirs in two sections, with a right angle turn where their garden wall intervened. Old Anders Bjornstad, who was 71 and had been homesteading in Kitson County since 1873, and who had survived conditions that had killed younger and stronger men, built his tunnel entirely of stacked stone, an undertaking that took him the entire summer, and that his son said was the most stubborn thing he had ever seen a man do, which Anders took as a compliment. What they all shared was the principle Edith had arrived at on the 3rd of February in a snowdrift with a coal shovel and 14 pounds of cornmeal and 6 hours of fuel remaining, that the distance between safety and danger in a Minnesota winter is often not a matter of temperature or storm intensity or the quality of your walls. It is a matter of connection, of whether the things you need are accessible or merely present. A Springhouse full of food 40 feet away might as well be 40 miles away if the weather between you and it is capable of killing you before you cover the distance. A tunnel changes that. A tunnel makes the distance irrelevant. It converts the weather from a barrier into a background condition, something that is happening above you while you move through the earth below it, untouched. The tunnel Edith Callaway dug on the 3rd of February, 1891, is not recorded in any official document. There is no engineering report, no agricultural extension bulletin, no territorial gazette feature story. She was a widow on a hill claim in Kitson County, Minnesota, and what she did was solve a problem with the materials she had in the time she had available, which is the definition of frontier engineering, and which rarely generates paperwork. What is recorded in the County Historical Society's collection of personal letters and diaries donated by local families in the 1940s and 1950s is a letter from Margaret Solberg to her sister in Wisconsin, written in March of 1891, describing the tunnel and its builder in terms that are brief and precise and entirely characteristic of the woman who wrote them. She says that Edith Callaway dug 22 feet through a 6-foot drift in a single day with a coal shovel and a garden spade, and that when Margaret arrived after the storm, she found her widening the entrance for easier access, already thinking about next winter. She says that the Springhouse on the other end was 51 degrees and fully stocked, and that the spring was running clear. She says that Eric has decided to do the same thing before next winter, and that she thinks he is right. She does not editorialize. She does not call it remarkable or brave or ingenious. She simply describes what she saw, which was a woman who had identified a problem, engineered a solution, and executed it alone under conditions that would have stopped most people before they started. That restraint in the description is itself a kind of tribute. It treats what Edith did as a thing that makes complete sense, which it does, how once you understand the problem she was solving and the resources she had available, and the particular quality of mind required to see the connection between them when the barometer is not moving and the fuel is running out and the storm shows no sign of ending. The ability to act on what you know, when what you know is the only thing standing between you and a very serious outcome. That quality does not have a clean name. It is part courage and part engineering, and part the specific stubbornness of a person who has decided that the situation is not going to be allowed to win. Edith Callaway had all three in the particular combination that the frontier required, and on the 3rd of February, in a Minnesota winter, she put all three to work in a snowdrift behind her cabin and came out the other side with a tunnel and a changed arithmetic and enough food to last until spring. If you find value in these stories of quiet courage and frontier problem solving, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who would appreciate it. We document these accounts because the people in them deserve to be remembered, and because the principles they lived by remain as sound today as they were on the Minnesota plains in the winter of 1891. The specific problems change. The quality of mind required to solve them does not. Subscribe and help keep this knowledge alive. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction of frontier life in Minnesota in the 1890s. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the survival challenges, the engineering principles, and the historical circumstances described are grounded in the documented reality of homesteading life on the northern plains during this period.